Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in the globe. Good to be again on the microphone, and always another opportunity to learn and grow with our guests. One of the things, and I kind of used learn and grow because we always talk about thinking and how important it is to be a critical thinker and really think about how we think and how we learn. And if you're an educator or even in a corporate environment, that's really important. How do we self-reflect on the way we're thinking and what we're doing, and what are some of the challenges and what are some of the strategies and maybe tools that we can use as a team, as an individual. And in schools, if you are in a school that is maybe more IB focused, there's this whole inquiry, asking questions, and more questions bring about more questions. There has been a lot of talk because of artificial intelligence where we kind of subcontract some of our thinking. I mean, it's seamless, it's frictionless, it's really convenient. You know, you're at the grocery store, you have to buy a product, you're not sure if it's right. Take a picture, ChatGPT gives you an answer. You might even be having PowerPoints being made by Claude, or you even sending agents out to do some research and write your research paper. There are different permutations, and what we have seen is an acceleration of the capacity of the tools. And I always remind people this is not a technology tool, it's a system. It is more than a tool. It's a system that thinks, that has the capacity to actually cross-examine itself. It is not a human being. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't have a soul, but very often it feels like it does. And these tools are becoming more powerful. We're seeing them in all different contexts. They are in schools. Our children, as young as 3, are being exposed to them, be it through Alexa or watching their parents on ChatGPT asking something at dinner. So this idea of thinking is definitely something that's really important. We hold that as a value-added proposition in schools. That's something that we feel we really want kids to walk away, to be able to think about their thinking and then think about their learning. But what happens when you can subcontract that out and you're just in a transaction and you're getting stuff back, and maybe you're not as critical or responding or questioning or challenging? So today I feel really lucky. We have Timothy Cook. He's an international educator and AI researcher and the director of the Cognitive Privacy Project. And I really, really encourage you to go to this website, which is in the show notes, because I think there's some really interesting things that he's doing. With more than a decade of teaching experience across 4 countries, he studies how AI and algorithmic systems are reshaping children's thinking, their learning, their identity, and development. He's also the founder of Connected Classroom, and I'm sure many educators around the world are familiar with that. And he writes the Algorithmic Mind for Psychology Today, where he's exploring the impact of AI, cognition, and creativity. Tim brings so much experience, and I really have enjoyed his postings and his articles, because I think this is something that maybe for schools we need to really focus in on, because kind of the nectar and the enjoyment and the frictionless of having these tools so easily maybe gets us to be a little lazy. And this is not a criticism. I think I do it myself. It's just being honest. Sometimes we are quite comfortable offloading. It's just sometimes easier than doing the heavy lifting and the hard learning. Tim, thank you so much for being part of the International Schools Podcast.
Glad to be here. And I concur. I do think, who doesn't like offloading a few difficult tasks for here and there?
Yeah, I think so too. And sometimes, and I'm sure you too, when you're busy and you do consulting, you're running, 2, 3 different things. There's nothing better to ask an agent to go and do some heavy lifting, and then you can focus on something else. But I think the one thing that, Tim, that you really have emphasized in the work and the articles is when you talk about cognitive privacy, what do you mean, and what parts of children's thinking are you most concerned about protecting?
Okay, well, I think let's think about what privacy is first. And oftentimes when we think of privacy, individual privacy, we think of protecting our data, our likeness, our image, our credit card number, right? Social security number. And there's a lot of laws that exist to protect this kind of data. But what we don't have any frameworks for, any laws for, is who's observing us think or what's observing us think. And for both adults and children, algorithms and AI in particular has gotten to the point where it can infer intent based on the way you use it. And this isn't owned by you, right? While maybe your chat history is technically owned by you, the inferences made about you as a person when you use a tool are owned by the company, right? So when I think of cognitive privacy, I really think of it in terms of, okay, well, take me and you, for example. Like, what was the worst breach of privacy that could have happened to you when you were a child?
Me?
No,
Well,
like privacy. Like, what's the worst breach of it when you were growing up?
I'm just trying to think if there was even a breach of privacy. I mean, it's my brother told on me that I had gone to the local grocery store and bought some cigarettes. I think, that might have been it. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's a great question. I think, and your point's really important, because if I think of my age and my generation, privacy was a very different thing. And I come from a culture in Switzerland where we are very private in the way we live, even though we're kind of crowded in a small space. Privacy is really something that is quite important. And in the political landscape and in the cultural landscape, that is something. So yeah, I think my context is very different than I think of my son and daughter, who are, in their late 20s and early 30s.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, it's probably, I didn't like getting my picture taken when I was a kid by my grandparents, right? But everyone, they take a picture. But they owned that picture and it was for themselves, right? So it wasn't. Now, if, your aunt takes a picture of your kid, I have almost a 3-year-old daughter. And we try not to have our family post anything online, but once you do, these algorithmic systems can infer a lot about your family, who you're connected to. They know I have a 3-year-old daughter, right? And then this obviously, I mean, everyone's probably experienced kind of a dynamic marketing, right? Based on maybe a way that they've used the internet or what was posted before. So these systems really even get a little more deep into that when it starts to infer on cognitive behavior. And I will give an example, because this was very explicit. This came out this year. I think it was in February. The February update for TikTok is very explicit on tracking something called pre-upload scanning. And this is AI technology that's embedded into the algorithm once it was sold to the American companies. And what this does is it allows TikTok to scan your pre-drafts or the videos that you create, but you decide not to upload. And this is what I mean about cognitive privacy, because if I'm a 15-year-old kid and I'm doing one of those dance videos or something, and I have my shirt off and I want to, I'm trying to get some engagement, and I ultimately record 3 or 4 of those videos and I decide, you know what, I don't like the way I look, I'm not going to post this. TikTok can infer from that you decided not to post those videos and you posted something safe instead, that maybe you have a little bit of insecurity about your body. Right? It can make that behavioral inference. I'm not saying that there's nefarious intent behind it. And I want to make it very clear that when I talk about AI today and privacy, that I'm looking at what the architecture of the tool allows for. And you said it earlier when you talked about structure, not necessarily what the intent of the user is, the intent of a school, the intent of the company, the intent of the CEO. These are all different. But what does the architecture allow to happen if used, incorrectly?
Yeah. I think what's really interesting that you're bringing up here, Tim, is that we're really talking, there's this attention economy where we were scrolling through the feeds and they had our attention. But what you're describing is that now they're looking at our intentions. In other words, even before maybe we've decided, and the great example that you just gave of the young gentleman that's thinking about doing a dance video with his shirt off, and then after 4 or 5 tries says, no, I'm not going to do that. They know these intentions, and these intentions then can be used to maybe market something about building your body or about boys that are not feeling confident, take this or whatever. So I think it's really fascinating how you bring this idea that it's now the intention that is now really of interest more just than our attention.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So when you have been involved with this and you're starting to look at this, when did you decide that kind of AI is just not a technology issue, but a child development issue? Because you really focus on kids. That's one of the things that you've really leaned in on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what's so interesting, because you and I have that life experience. We have experience before privacy, or we read and we know that, yes, there's this intention economy, etc. But kids, I'm just thinking some of the kids I teach are young as 3, they don't. So tell us a bit, when did you suddenly feel like, oh, time out, this is nothing about technology, this is about development?
Well, I've taught elementary school for a very long time, and I'm now a father, and I love watching my daughter develop. And I do find it very interesting. Like, when I look at her and how she navigates the world, how does she learn? How does she build her neural architecture? It's not from me explaining things to her or feeding her bits of content, right? She struggles to communicate at times. She struggles like, how do I get this point across to my parents so that they hear me or get what I want? She falls down, she gets bruises when she's learning how to walk or move around. This is how we learn, right? This is how first graders learn. This is how third graders learn. They learn through friction, struggle, experimentation, going on tangents. This is how human beings learn. And when I first started to use AI, I actually started using large language models fairly late. I think it was early 2025. And I thought it was an interesting technology. And it felt very easy. Felt very easy to use. And at the time when I was using it, it's gotten better since, but in early 2025, there were more instances of hallucination and just factually incorrect information than there are now. The models have significantly improved. And I started to notice that after about a month of using it, that things I were looking up or using it for were oftentimes wrong, and that there was a very clear Western bias in a lot of the models.
Yes.
Right? And I was able to kind of pick that up because I've been living in so many different countries. I could see like all of the information that it would give you is very Western focused. Again, since then, it's gotten a little bit better. So as a teacher, as a father, and with my own experience with the tool, which I find very helpful oftentimes, I did start feeling like, wow, this is very easy to use. If I start using it as a kid, right? There's no friction. There's no struggle. It gives me whatever I want. I mean, just think about when my daughter is having a tantrum or emotional breakdown, right? And she wants attention, but maybe I'm in the kitchen cooking and I can't give it to her right now because I'm holding a hot pan. I can't give instantaneous feedback. And same in the classroom. There's 20 kids in the classroom. You can't give kids instantaneous feedback anytime they want it at any moment. But you know it can? AI, right? And this is why we've seen already a lot of harmful examples of kids forming emotional attachments to it. There's a me, myself, and I report from the UK that shows that like 40% of kids already form emotional attachments to AI, and they would prefer to go to AI for advice than a human being, a teacher or a parent. So, it's because it's frictionless. It's so easy. I might as well just ask this tool for advice. It's going to give me it quicker than my parent or my teacher. Right. So this is kind of where I've determined it was a developmental issue, not a technology issue.
So the one thing that you've been describing about your daughter, the tantrum, and also kind of when she's trying to ask questions and, is trying to navigate and getting pieces of information, and her cognition also is trying to put them together and say, okay, I get what they're saying, or I'm not clear. And those descriptions are really about the struggle of learning, kind of the heavy lifting that has to occur. And then your point, so important, is suddenly we have this frictionless technology, who at times, as you stated, can be very Western focused or even make hallucinations. So when a child or a teenager, maybe even, what parts of their learning do you think then are at risk? There's attention, there's confidence, there's this kind of ability to struggle through something on your own. And I'm just thinking of my own experience of school struggling actually constantly. I'm just wondering, where do you see that their learning is like, hold on, we are going to lose something here if we don't focus on that?
Okay. I can give you an interesting example that occurred this year that I think summarizes the concerns holistically. And then I can, if you want me to get a little bit more technical about it, I can. But we were doing a animal research project, and a student came up to me. She said, or she showed me her research about Komodo dragons. And I said, oh, that's really good. Where did you find that information? And she said, oh, AI told me. And I thought to myself, well, kids don't have access to AI at the school, right? Like, there's no way AI could have told you. And I said, well, what do you mean AI told you? Can you show me? So she brought her iPad and she showed me the AI overview from Google,
which you did the search, the summary,
that point been deployed, across everyone's probably seen it at this point. When you search something in Google now, the first thing you see is an AI overview.
Yeah.
And this really struck me because you can't ban AI. It's in the fabric of the systems that we now use and kids have access to. But what is really concerning about this is, well, when you and me were in elementary school and if we were researching Komodo dragons, the only option that we could have gone to is the library. So you'd probably look at different books about Komodo dragons, and your library would probably have different books than my library. So we actually may come to completely different conclusions about Komodo dragons. I may be interested in the way that it hunts or eats or the venomous nature. You might be interested in its habitat. We don't really know. It could be, it's very, very diverse. 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even now kids have Google. There's applications that I think are beneficial a lot of times to elementary school students, like Pebble Go, and there's Get, where you have all of these depositories of just tons of different books. So all of these books. At the end of the day, wherever the kids decided to get this information from, the end of that stack is them synthesizing that information into something that makes sense for them. Enter AI overview, which starts with the synthesis, and it does that entire process for you, right? So normally when we learn something, we go through a progression of looking things up, trying to internalize what it means, taking multiple pieces of information, putting them together, and then creating that synthesis, both from how we've been taught in the class, our own interpretation of the reading, and maybe a unique experience that we might have had. Maybe like I actually went to Komodo Island. So I would probably synthesize my research on Komodo dragons differently than someone else. Once you use that AI overview, everyone's getting the exact same synthesis, no matter where it's used, whether it's in Alabama or Amman or Shanghai, right? We're all collectively getting that same information interpreted in the same way, fed to us with zero effort. And that's where it hit me that this is a huge risk for children's learning. It's not that they didn't get the information. It's that they didn't do the work of getting the information. And thus, the likelihood that they remember any of it, or the process, which wasn't actually to learn about Komodo dragons, the process was to research and to understand something about an animal of your choice, that would be foreclosed, essentially not built.
And that idea that you bring up of kind of, the whole grade is doing AI summaries on the Komodo dragon, and now we have a vanilla research project. Everybody's kind of the same, there's this similarity. And it's this kind of thinking. Do you think as kids are starting to do that, are they also, when they're not in front of AI, they're leaning in on trying to be, on that vanilla idea of like, let's just go with a common denominator? Do you think that starts getting them to think differently about information, where they're just trying to take it and assume and not think about it?
Yes. So there's three main risks from a technical sense, and there's a lot of research supporting this with adult users. And I'm sure many of us have actually experienced a few of these things. So what you're getting to right now is actually what I call the difference between verification and authorship. And what AI is really good at is taking your scrambled thoughts or your question or your prompt, feeding it back to you confidently, and then providing you what's called a continuation, right? Would you like me to do this or this after? Now, what the research has showed, and this is research on sycophancy, is that human beings, adults, are almost always going to choose from AI continuations than to push back and say, no, I don't want to do any of this, right? And it's because AI is 49% more sycophantic than human beings. Sycophantic meaning that the architecture of it's to keep you using it and engage you. And it's more likely to tell you that your idea is pretty good, or we can work with that, than be like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Please log off immediately. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one risk, sycophancy. The other one that you just mentioned is homogenization, which is the flattening of collective output, right? I have a ton of examples from high school teachers that I've talked to about, like, they give a reading to the kids and they all come in with the same exact ideas, right? Where in a high school class when I grew up, and it's true that the average idea is probably a little bit higher than an average human idea, but the variance is very compressed. So in a class when I grew up, there'd be a wide variance of ideas coming from a reading. There'd be some really bad ones and there'd be some exceptionally creative ones, right? But AI has basically put everything more converged to the middle. And then there's the dependency component, which is offloading over and over again until it's difficult to sit with boredom. And I think if you applied kind of what's happened to kids with social media and how it's almost impossible for anyone to sit for 10 minutes without opening their phone, this is going to be very similar with AI. Is you don't know something, the first thing you're going to do is open up ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini and just get that kind of for you right away. So those are really the big three issues with AI and how it affects adult cognition. So when applied to kids, it's even more dangerous.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I have talked to leaders that say, if I get another goal setting document from ChatGPT, I'm going to shoot myself. Because what are people doing? They're taking the strategic plan or whatever it might be, and then they're just pumping it into whatever large language model, say, make 3 goals. I'm this kind of teacher, this. And you also, I do workshops with parents, and they always want to know what percentage of these reports are written by AI and what percentage are original. because, as you say, this vanilla starts creeping up. I already find that most emails I get, I think a lot of them are written by AI. There's just this language, and it kind of is, as you said in the example of the high school teacher with the essays. They might be better ideas, but it's kind of in this narrow tunnel, and at the end of the day, it just feels like the same flavor. And I think that's really interesting how you explain that, because I think we, even as adults, forget that. I think that's the issue, is if you're in a pedagogic environment and you yourself are falling to those three categories that you described, how does that then allow you to be very critical and thoughtful about how you're engaging with kids or how they're engaging with AI? And I think one of the questions, is you have this kind of narrative, be careful, AI is weakening learning. But then on the other side, they're saying you need to use AI to be ready for the future. How are kids and adults, and I mean, we're really talking about children and teenagers, how are they dealing with this mixed message? What are we doing sending out these mixed messages?
Well, we're putting them in a tight spot for sure. And I think even recently I was seeing in the New York Times and all over the news, I don't know if you've seen these videos of people giving commencement speeches at graduation.
Yes. Yeah.
And anyone that's talking about AI, the kids are all just like booing them.
Yeah.
Right? And they don't like it. College kids don't like it. And there's a few reasons for it. Well, one, there was a Gallup poll released about a month ago on Gen Z users, and 80% of kids surveyed, it was a very massive poll, said that they think AI is hurting their learning ability. 80% of kids believe this about the technology, but almost 60% also believe that they have to use it in order to get a job. So we're creating this like dissonance in kids' brains where they know that it's doing something harmful to them, yet they think that they should be using it. And we can't blame kids for using artificial intelligence, right? When it's so readily available, and when the education system that they're a part of still encourages producing a final product, and that's how they're assessed, right? The school model that's been around for a century is you produce this piece of work and we assess you on it, and that's your competency level, right? That's your level of competence. And this will determine whether or not you can get X, Y, and Z job or go to X, Y, and Z college. And as long as the incentives are still that, why wouldn't a kid use a more efficient way of getting there, right? Because school isn't saying, we really want you to be fantastic collaborators and critical thinkers. They are saying, we want you to do well on these AP tests, right? It makes us look good, and it also will get you into a better college.
I think and I agree with what you're saying, but I think also on the missions of schools, it's critical thinkers, resilient, global learners. So the narrative, there's also a mixed message in the missions and some of the values that school promote through their websites. Because at the end of the day, in June, and right now, April, May, June, hundreds of thousands of kids around the world are all sitting in line desk doing a test.
Yes.
So their message is like, well, I'm meant to be a critical thinker and a problem solver, but you have me filling up these dots.
Well, this goes, I was thinking about, Paulo Freire, his banking model.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And kind of what AI has been selling schools or any of these platforms that are marketing AI as a personalized learning thing. And the banking model of education has always been where just the teacher is going to deposit information to the student for them to regurgitate back at a later time to show that they know it. And AI companies are right now saying, well, we're going to fix that. we're going to make sure every kid has this personalized learning pathway. But personalizing learning isn't personalizing content delivery, which is really what's happening here. A good teacher knows that when you personalize learning, it's not just about content, it's about the growth of the student. It's about where they started, it's about where they came from, it's about the relationship that you have with that student. Maybe they've moved around to lots of different countries. Maybe they are an English language learner. Like, there's a lot of context that teachers have with students that an AI model wouldn't. So while an AI model might be able to personalize the way that content's delivered, it's not really personalized learning. It's just the most efficient banking technology ever.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, I just think that the promises of the technology are really just the most efficient way of having the system function just the way it is.
And not really challenging it or saying, let's rip this out and we're coming with a completely new proposition.
Yes. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we were talking about this mixed message and also how these AI companies, because now, if you are in a school and you're a purchasing person, or you may be involved with the IT systems, Google's got its Google Workspace for Education, Gemini, there's Copilot, even Anthropic and ChatGPT have education ones. It's in Broadstar, it's in Roadblocks. It's kind of showing up everywhere, right? And I think at the beginning, you were even saying quite clearly, these things are showing up and we're not really part of the conversation. You just, as the AI summary was a great example, where suddenly one day you turn on Google and there's the AI summary. There wasn't like an email saying, we're going to notify you here in a few days. And I think one thing that I would love to hear from you is, these things are being pushed out. Sometimes they're almost invisible. So I'm thinking of my mother with her, vacuum cleaner, or the fridge, or the smart TV. Now these are things coming into consumer products. And there is no really narrative or conversation because it's just being delivered. And you have on one side teachers saying, no, we're going to resist this, we're going to stop it, or we're not going to ethically, I don't agree to it, so in my class we're not going to have AI. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about, at some point we have to engage with this. Is it maybe not about not engaging or engaging, but how do you engage with it where you still continue lifting up the deep thinking, the heavy lifting? Because I'm sure you yourself, and we talked before we went on air, we're both using it, and we see, there's no doubt we see advantages, but young kids maybe not. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this idea of, where some educators are saying, let's just get it out of the classroom. We're getting back to pens and paper. We're going to have everybody write the essay, and then they won't deal with AI.
Yeah, this is why I keep coming back to this idea that this is not a technology issue, but it's a developmental issue. And I don't think we should be looking at AI as whether it's good or bad for the classroom, right? The fact is that generative AI, which is these models that we mostly are thinking about when we're talking about AI, is just really, it's one component of this ecosystem that's growing. And it's becoming embedded into all of the applications and technology that we already use. So to try and say, let's just ban it, or, right? Even if you open up Google Docs now, you can use Gemini right in it. What are we going to do? Ban kids from typing with Google Docs at school? It's part of the fabric of the structure that these kids are growing up within. So we really need to start thinking about the cognitive ecosystem and how a healthy kid develops. And the reason I don't think it's very useful to bring in an AI consultant to talk about how to use ChatGPT in the classroom effectively is because it's going to be more effective if teachers are trained in how students learn. And this science is not debatable. It's been around for decades and decades. We understand how children learn. And this is the root of how you become an effective user of AI, right? The higher order cognitive skills that we must cultivate in schools, those are the skills that give you effectiveness with the tool. High domain area expertise gives you effectiveness with prompting, artificial intelligence models, so that you can extend your thinking. Low domain area expertise will give you information that sounds competent, but that you will have no idea if is accurate or not, right? So we kind of need to go back to an era where thinking is valued in schools, and the pattern of reasoning, how kids learn to reason, is what should be promoted, I believe, as the focus of education. How do we think? How do we work together? How do we communicate? Now, I know that this poses challenges in a lot of school systems, because the first question that's always asked is, well, how do you assess that? Right? And that's a valid question.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you assess it? But I do think that this is the challenge that collectively as educators, we need to start thinking about, is not how and when do we use AI? Do we ban it here? Do we only use pencil and paper, right? We need to just focus on how people learn. And there's going to be places where AI is really effective in scaffolding that learning. And there's going to be places where it shouldn't be used at all. And I think an easy way to illustrate this is, I wrote an article for Psychology Today. It was the difference between how AI affects adult brains and how AI affects children's brains. And it's the most popular article I've written so far. And I think it really resonated with a lot of people, because for adults, we atrophy our cognitive muscles when we offload to AI consistently. But for children, if they haven't developed that skill, there's nothing to atrophy. It just doesn't develop. And I can use the GPS analogy, right? Where a child today can grow up theoretically, never knowing what a map is at all, never having to have to read a map. They just use GPS. If we just took GPS away from that kid and told them to drive from Philadelphia to New York City, they would not know how to do it.
Some adults would not be able to do that.
Well, some adults wouldn't either, but I wouldn't either.
Yeah.
But theoretically, because I did learn how to read a map, my dad
absolutely. Yeah, you would.
I could redevelop that skill.
Yeah.
Right.
You have the muscle there.
I do have the muscle there. So it's this difference between like losing a muscle that you can rebuild with a lot of effort, or not forming the muscle to begin with.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like a ecosystem. It just functions like one.
If you're like, I imagine I came from outer space and I start hearing this, and I would go into a school and I'm seeing tests and bells and, write this essay and answer these questions. I mean, are we at a point where kind of a red flag should be put up and say, time out, guys, we've got a bigger problem here? Because the fact is, if we're thinking that we have the muscle that we can bring back and we can tap into that old muscle and get it back up and running, then we're maybe not as conscious or as empathetic to the fact that kids don't have that muscle. And that actually what you're saying about thinking and learning, actually, should there be a complete recalibration of what the focus should be if we want to make sure those kids develop that kind of learning muscle, the ability to struggle, the ability to have resilience and problem solve, and be able to take different opinions and hear things that are not positive, and be able to take that in and juggle that and then make something concrete from it.
Well, that's perfect. So all of those things you just named, that is the cognitive ecosystem that we have to protect. And it's very fragile. I'll give another analogy because I love stories. This is how I teach. And I think that by explaining it this way, people will kind of see like what AI does to the brain. And again, it's not the tool doesn't intend to do this, and right, this technology wasn't designed for kids. It was designed for you. It was designed for me. It was designed for adults, right? So I don't know, 2 years ago, I was driving to upstate New York. We were meeting my wife's father, who has a boat. We were going to one of the Great Lakes. And before you get in the lake, they have to clear off the boat. On the bottom of it, there's these things, they're called zebra mussels in America. They're actually from Europe, and they're an invasive species that was brought over to America. And they were introduced into the Great Lakes. Now, this is such an efficient mussel. There's actually a native species of mussel that's in upstate New York, and it was in the Great Lakes. And those ecosystems have existed for thousands of years. There's the mussels, they filter like tiny zooplankton and phytoplankton out of the water. The little minnows eat it. There's bigger fish, trout, bass that eat those fish. Now, what happened when this more efficient mussel from Europe was introduced into this ecosystem? Well, what it did was it actually grew over top of the native species of mussel, right? Not maliciously, not because it intended to do so, but these mussels took over the native species and they kind of created these clumps. And they were so much more efficient at filtering the water. In the short term, it became much clearer, right? Because it was eating all of the plankton. But what ended up happening was then the little fish had nothing to eat. And then those large fish, the trout and the bass, they all died out because they had nothing to eat. And if you look at the trout, these large fish, as your higher order thinking skills, what happens when you push in a very efficient new technology into a fragile ecosystem is it doesn't take a lot to unbalance it. And while in the short term, you might think that there's clearer waters or a little bit more efficiency here, in the long term, those trout will die off. They won't give birth anymore. You won't have enough of them. And this is why like these invasive species are so dangerous when they're introduced into any ecosystem, right? They don't intend to harm the ecosystem.
Absolutely not.
It happens naturally and subtly, and it changes the way it works.
Do you think then, I mean, you know, there was the whole social media narrative, and it took us 15 years to finally realize this was not the greatest, and, you know, companies did have some agendas. Do you think that today schools are aware of, you know, we're going to use the term invasive species, that these algorithms and this atrophy and this whole ecosystem and system that is around everywhere, that's only going to become more powerful? We have agentic AI now. So before long, you know, kids could have agents doing their work, or schools. I'm just wondering, do you feel there is a greater urgency than maybe in other contexts where we've had these technology changes? Let's imagine the laptop, the iPad, the phone. I'm just wondering, where do you feel schools should be really thinking about this, and how much should that become more of a priority? You know, you have strategic plans and everything. Should this be one of the lines that is not ignored?
Well, we can apply the logic of foreseeability here. And you mentioned social media, but there's also tons of examples of it with lead and water, right? Social media, chemicals in building chemical plants next to rivers, etc. There's actually a lot of really good laws with dangerous products, right? So for example, if I'm a pharmaceutical company developing a drug, I don't deploy the drug on the general population and then decide later if it was harmful or not. I actually have to prove that it's not harmful before I give it to a person. And with AI companies or tech companies in general, what they often do is they give you the 50-page terms of conditions in order to use the application, and you just push accept. You don't read it. And the schools push accept. And very rarely does anyone read what that company is collecting from you or taking from you. Why are you being able to use it for free? Well, it's not really free. You're often giving away something. So I think that schools need to start applying foreseeability and what I'd call a safeguard inversion, which is, well, companies want to put the onus on the individual, right, with free will to make that decision. So a 13-year-old that signs up for ChatGPT and clicks yes, I'm going to give over my cognitive data to you. Well, that child made that decision. I don't have any liability here of what happens to that person. They made the decision. But I think what schools really need to push for is an inversion of that. A company should have to prove that it doesn't infer behavior from a child, right? It should be able to prove that it doesn't influence the way a child's thinking, and it should prove that it doesn't lead to dependency. And I think a very simple solution to this, and I'm sure a lot of companies would disagree, but it's actually very simple. And all of the applications I develop on Connected Classroom adhere to this logic, which is ephemeral data processing. And what that means is if a child is interacting with an AI tool to support their learning, after that chat is over or that engagement is over, that data no longer needs to be available anymore. It's wiped. And the next time I log on, it doesn't know who Timothy Cook is. It doesn't know I'm using it. It's just a clean blank space every time. And the reason for that is because kids are ephemeral. We don't exist as the same being 2 hours from now. We're all different. We change constantly. And when I interact with an AI tool on Tuesday and I'm feeling bad about myself, or I don't feel engaged in school today, and then that system determines or infers something about me because of that singular interaction, well, that's not who I am as a person. That's who I am in that moment, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
AI tools shouldn't be able to create a comprehensive memory of its user, right? Even in the name of what they'll say is, well, this will be better for personalized learning, right?
Or they say a better experience, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, there are all kinds of narratives that kind of
However they want to
amplify that.
convince
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And I think one of the challenges is, you know, Amy Webb from the Future Strategy Group always says there are 9 companies, you know, there are 4 Chinese companies and 5 American companies that basically run the big AI systems, that have the compute power, have the technology, the money, the data centers, the chips, etc. And I think this is what's so challenging, is that those organizations don't have to play the same way, say, if a government that is elected or a city council. And I think one of the things that we're facing is that there are these kind of autocratic, or these organizations that have immense power with very little accountability that we're dealing with. And your suggestion of really making sure schools ask those questions and demand that of the tech companies is really important. But that's a serious discipline, and an individual school doing that is going to find it much harder than, say, all 10,000 international schools come together in some consortium.
Sure, but I don't think it needs. I think making that decision visible is really the most important part. And if I was a school talking to a vendor about some AI platform that they were going to apply, that should be a transparent process. It should be transparent in terms of, here's what this company is going to collect from us. We've audited their terms and conditions. We as a school, we believe that even though this platform does X, Y, and Z, we think it will support our goals and our learning at the school because of these reasons, right? I call this a cognitive privacy impact assessment.
Yeah.
And going through a list of questions whenever you adopt an AI tool is really to just make that decision visible. It's not to say we can never use AI at our school, right? It's just to audit how it can affect child development. And once you make that thinking visible, then the school has more power over when it isn't deployed.
Yeah,
right? So for
absolutely.
example, that AI synthesis thing. Well, now that I know that, now that it's been visible, I've talked about it, I've experienced it, right? Next time I do that project, I will not allow students to use Google, right? It's not that I'll never let them use Google. It's for that specific project because the point of that project was synthesis, that I can't have a tool that replaces synthesis, right? Or else they won't learn how to do it.
But I think this is really important. What you're saying is that as a pedagogue and an educator, you need to understand these systems so you know that if it's replacing synthesis, that's something, a moment when I won't use the AI summary, and we might go to the library, or we might get primary resources, or we might even, call up a local organization, whatever it is. I think that what you're sharing is really important. That really becomes a bigger responsibility for you as you define your learning objectives and outcomes, and where does the tool or the system, as we call AI, come into play. And there are going to be moments where maybe it makes sense to synthesize. If you have 20 research papers and you want to get one big theme, we're not going to ask you to read 20 research papers at 150 pages each. That's just, so, and maybe that's a bad example, but I just think what you're stating is so important. There is now a new skill, is defining when do I make sure and protect that metacognition and thinking, and when is it okay to say, you know what, we're going to let a bit of AI come in, or we're going to do this project with AI because maybe that is also a good thinking exercise.
Yeah, it is. And I think as long as the teacher is the one scaffolding with AI, and AI isn't scaffolding for the student,
yes,
then it's a completely different way of using the technology.
And for me, as we both agree on this point, it only amplifies the importance that schools really need to understand this, not just as a tool, but as a system, and using the lens of cognitive privacy, as you said, and really understanding, no, okay, it's a tool, but what is it doing to thinking? What do we think is our treasured thing that we do at our school about thinking, and understand that AI impacts that, and being able then to reconfigure and redesign and choreograph experiences where we ensure that still happens. And sometimes it might not happen, but we have a balance.
Yeah, I agree.
If schools wanted to take, a lot of schools have the Google Workspace for Education, the Copilot, they have it in ManageBack, they have it in Toddle, and, it helps write reports, it makes units plan and everything. What would be one thing you would, as we're coming to the end of this fantastic conversation, what is your caution, or what is your maybe just, hey, let's take a time out, let's pause, let's find the dedicated time to have this one conversation in our school as we get caught up in the frictionless and kind of the ease of AI? What should we, and maybe it's a regular conversation that we have as part of our year, as part of staff meetings, team meetings.
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question before. Honestly, I think these conversations, oftentimes when we talk about AI, there's people that are very pro AI. There's people that are like Luddite. I never want to touch it. A lot of people use AI and they hide it because there's maybe a negative perception about it. Some people use it really well. Some people don't, right? Similarly, sometimes I get an email that's 6 paragraphs long that could have been said in 2 sentences. And I'm like, well, someone clearly used ChatGPT for this, right? But making this conversation transparent with both teachers and kids is really the first path any school should take when they're talking about AI. I was talking to some professors and also just teachers in school, and I have yet to hear one institution that has asked high school kids, right, about what they think the AI policy should be. No one talks to kids about what they think the tool should be used for. I actually ran an experiment in my 3rd grade classroom. It was an ethical dilemma scenario. And I just posed the question, how would you feel if a teacher used AI to give you feedback? And these are kids that don't use AI. Like, the only thing that they've done is either internalized conversations from their parents, or just because it's in pop culture. And almost all of the students said that they thought that would be a bad idea because, quote, like, they didn't think I would know or read their writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And right now we're kind of in this moment where teachers are given tasks that they're like, oh man, I've always hated doing these tasks, right? Like you were giving an example earlier about those reports. I'll just have AI do it, right? Well, schools need to think, well, what were the point of those tasks? Were they compliance tasks? Was it just like to feed our system and be like, every single teacher did this report, we're on schedule for our strategic initiative, or to get accredited or whatever it is? Well, what was the point of that task? If everyone's just going to use AI for it, maybe we should reconsider what the task is for and come up with a different one, right? Same with kids. If all of your kids are using AI to help write their essay, well, you need to think, well, ask them, like, well, what's the point of this task? What are we really trying to teach here? These conversations, I don't think have to be difficult. I think they just need to be honest. They just need to be open. And once we all collectively as an international school community, or within your own school, every school is going to be different. That's how you come up with an AI policy that is followed by both teachers and students. It's not hidden, right? This is when people can really start experimenting freely without feeling like they're either going to get in trouble or make a mistake. Everyone's at a different point. That culture of transparency around this emerging technology is, I think, the most important.
And I think it's so nice the way you finish up this conversation with this idea of shared ownership, because I think it's the ownership with the students and the teachers having that conversation. And I think you're really, we're dumping AI on these kids with whatever we do and our reports and stuff. And really what you're saying is, let's be open, let's be honest, let's be transparent, and let's have some shared ownership. And what we're going to decide is how we're going to behave and interact with these environments, and be able to do it in a place where there's nobody's guilty or not guilty, or that's right or wrong. And I think that's just so important, what you're saying. Thank you, Tim. That has just been really a true privilege to talk to you. And I do want to remind our audience, go to the show notes. You can read some of Tim's work at his blog, The Algorithmic Mind, and then there's Classroom Connect and cognitiveprivacy.org. Those are all resources that I really highly recommend you spend some time. And Tim is talking in various workshops and is out on the circuit. And so don't hesitate to catch up with him on LinkedIn, and you'll get to see some of the things that he's doing and these conversations that will continue. And Tim, actually in 2 years, when agentic AI is kind of like Facebook was 20 years, I think we should have another conversation, because I was just reading about these grading agents. Are you familiar with the grading agents?
Do you want to go down this rabbit hole right now?
Oh, I'm not going to. I'll leave it at that. But it's just the acceleration is just phenomenal. Tim, thank you for your very open, candid, and all the expertise that you bring to this conversation. And what I so appreciate, it's always about the student and the learning and how important we need to be gatekeepers of that in our different contexts and different schools. And however much sometimes we're challenged to pause and just turn off the large language model and think about the thinking. So thank you very much for being with us today. Yeah. And to our audience, thank you again for all the LinkedIn comments and posts and feedback. This dialogue and really listening from you and hearing from you is so important. And we really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for being with us.